Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
Paulina Bren, who is an award-winning historian and also a professor at Vassar College. The Barbizon, I went to Barnet College, and in those days, they didn't really have dorms to accommodate everyone. And the Barbizon was where parents from all across America wanted their daughters to go because no men allowed. It had very strict rules and regulations, women only, and it had some of the leading women of that time. They had people living there like Grace Kelly, Sylvia Plath, who wrote The Bell Jar, which is the fictionalized version of what the Barbizon was all about. Esther Greenwood. There were so many incredible women. Gail Green, who lived there in this hotel, which came to life in the 1920s, 1928. And it was the most unique place. But I'm curious, Paulina, what made you think about the Barbizon all this later?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm delighted. And yes, actually, the paperback came out just a month or two ago. So it's true, the book is a year old, but the paperback is out. What made me want to write about the Barbizon? I mean, it had to be written about. It's such an important place. It was a place that really was sort of an incubator for, as you noted, these women who became famous later. But it was also fascinating to see them sort of in that milieu, being young, vulnerable, scared like everybody else, coming to New York to sort of try to act out their ambition. So it needed to be written. Of course, I thought, well, famous hotel, famous women stayed there. There are going to be so many records left of the time. Not at all. Everything disappeared. There are no blueprints. There are no guest registries, nothing. And so I have to say it was a real adventure sort of trying to build this hotel back, in a sense, using interviews and photographs and letters I found and office memos and so forth. So it was a real plethora of investigation, I would say. But it was exciting, and it has its place now. The Barbizon has its history, and it's also a history of New York through the 20th century. It's a history of the women's experience through the 20th century.
Right, and a lot of people today don't realize that then Mademoiselle magazine, and magazines were such a major part of all of our lives. And the Barbizon was where Mademoiselle put up their winners every year of the guest editor contest, and one of the leading secretarial schools in the world. I remember I got out of Barnet College and I was expected not to get an MBA, but to go to one of these major schools, right?
Yes, exactly. All of this is forgotten. And it's interesting, you bring up Mademoiselle magazine, and that was a key way for me to literally enter the hotel was through Mademoiselle magazine. But I was surprised because I remembered Mademoiselle magazine from the 80s when it was sort of a B-rated magazine at best, sort of a fluffy teenage young woman magazine. I hadn't realized it had this remarkable history where it was not only was it a pioneer in so many ways, and it created the concept of a youth market, but it also, in many ways, because the woman who ran it, Betsy Talbot Blackwell, who was editor-in-chief from the 1930s until 1917, she was remarkable. And one of the things she did, well, she did many things, but one of them simply, they didn't have much of a budget for fiction to pay writers, so they ended up really having cutting-edge fiction in Mademoiselle because they could pay those writers less. And then they, of course, became famous later. So the magazine was just top-notch in terms of fashion, but also in terms of literature. And it was why young women like Sylvia Plath and Joan Didion were desperate to get one of these famed summer internships at Mademoiselle magazine, because if you wanted to be a writer, you wanted to be an artist, you wanted to win that competition and be brought to New York and sort of shadow the editors at Mademoiselle magazine and stay at the Barbizon Hotel. And Betsy Talbot Blackwell had intentionally decided when this program started in the 1940s, she decided that it was vital that the young women who win this prize, that they stay at the Barbizon, because it was the only way she could get parents to sign off that their little girls came to New York without chaperones. And that was a big thing then.
And they weren't girls of enormous wealth. They were mostly ambitious middle-class girls. And if they wanted to stay there, it wasn't like a done deal. You had to get into that hotel.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, you're absolutely right to point out that these competition winners at Mademoiselle magazine who were staying at the Barbizon, they really did come from middle-class, working-class backgrounds. They would not have been able to stay at the Barbizon otherwise, but they were often also shocked because the internship didn't pay that much, so they were really scrounging. Luckily, they were invited as part of their time in New York. They were invited to these lunches and dinners and sort of all these events where they make sure they ate. So that was really important. But yeah, they what I also try to do in the book is juxtapose somebody famous with a friend who was there also often as part of the program, with a friend who was from a very different background, and sort of so that we could really see. So, for example, for Joan Didion, I juxtapose her with her best friend from Berkeley, Peggy LaViolette, and it's really interesting to see it this way. In the same way, Sylvia Plath, I really contrast with Neva Nelson, and we always talk about Sylvia Plath, who, of course, as you rightly said, wrote The Bell Jar, which is a spot-on description, basically, of her time there, and so with Sylvia Plath, we often talk about her father died when she was young, and her mother ran secretarial courses to keep the family in sort of that middle-class mode and so forth. But one of the women who was there at the Barbizon at Mademoiselle in 1953 with Sylvia Plath was Neva Nelson. Neva came from a far worse background. She had grown up in the foster system in California. Her parents were alive, but they were alcoholics. They couldn't take care of her. She was in and out of foster homes. By high school, she was living in a motel. And she managed through this competition to get herself to New York and stay in the Barbizon alongside Sylvia Plath and others who became well known later. So it was sort of these remarkable stories that took place inside this hotel.
I know. Felicia Richard
Yes.
and Liza Minnelli. You had absolutely everyone. And you just didn't check into the hotel. They had to approve you at the desk.
Yes, exactly. And you were grade as ABC, and a lot of people speculated that had to do with your looks. It actually had to do with your age. So if you were sort of 22 and under, you were an A. So you can imagine what a C and a D was. And because the hotel wanted to keep up its image of the most glamorous women's hotel in New York, even though the reality behind those walls was very different. This was their sort of public face. And so it was important to management that they bring in young women. Indeed, the hotel was called the Doll's House in the 1950s. A lot of models and actresses stayed there, so it was known for this. So they would bring in young women. Of course, it depended on what time of year you arrived and tried to get a room. The rush, of course, was sort of August, September, October. But if you arrived in February and you were in your 30s, you had a much better shot.
Right. And they had a coffee shop, which
Yes.
was very desirable because you could sit alone or you could pick someone up. There were always men in the lobby of this hotel.
Oh, exactly. As you said, men could not go beyond the lobby. And of course, they tried, and there were many famous incidents of men claiming they had made it up past the lobby. But what I also sort of quintessential Barbizon is the way it was built. It was this Italianate lobby, inlaid floor, and it also had a mezzanine level, which was a wraparound balcony. And so it was perfect for the young women to look down and see other women's dates, but also some women, they used that to check out a blind date they had, and if they didn't like what they saw, they would sort of run back to their rooms, or they'd leave the Barbizon through the coffee shop. That was another way out. And yeah, right, the coffee shop, I mean, J.D. Salinger would lurk there and pretend he was a Canadian hockey player to pick up women. It was the place to be seen, but also, exactly as you say, Sylvia Plath sort of famously talks about how she was sort of sitting in that coffee shop having her morning coffee on the day of the Rosenberg's execution, how upset she was. It's both in her diary and also in the bell jar. So it was a very important appendage to the Barbizon.
And when you found the women, some of who are gone, long gone,
of course,
were they eager to talk to you?
Let me see. Yes, they were eager to talk to me, and particularly I have to do a shout out to Neva Nelson, who, as I say, was there with Sylvia Plath and had a very sort of hard knocks life up until then. She had decided at a certain point to try to locate the other women in the Sylvia Plath group. And so she had sort of become a little bit of an archivist, and she was super helpful. And women were willing to talk, but it was really, when you write about a time and the women you write about are still alive, you have a certain responsibility. I certainly feel that way. So when my book first came out, just as a sort of a draft, the reader's copy that they send out, I made sure I sent out a reader's copy to each of the women that I interviewed. And of course I was terrified because they'd had really bad experiences before with other books, and that was one reason a lot of them were reluctant, particularly the 1953 Sylvia Plath Barbizon group were very reluctant to speak initially because of their bad experiences. So I sent it out, and I have to say that was probably my greatest, happiest moment, was that so many of them wrote to me and said, for the first time I feel seen and I understand my own decisions at the time because I see it within the larger picture. And that's really, and in many ways it was great relief for them. Some of them made decisions that they weren't too happy about, but they realized the pressure under which they were living at the time, sort of, the way one internalizes one's decisions and forgets that it's part of the zeitgeist. It's part, you don't have that many choices, or you feel you don't have them. And so that was really gratifying to feel like I'd sort of nailed it, and they were telling me that I'd nailed it. So that was lovely.
Yes, and you found it. I mean, the cultural institutions of the time, when I got out of Barnet, unless you wanted to be a doctor, or a lawyer,
right?
You definitely went, if you could afford it, to secretarial school.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And Katie Gibbs, of course, was the most famous one. And Katie Gibbs was so popular in the 1930s, particularly when all these women who had indeed graduated from Barnard, graduated from Vassar, but it was the Great Depression, that bachelor's degree was meaningless. They needed secretarial school. So Katie Gibbs, in fact, became more competitive to get in than Barnard and Vassar and so forth, because it gave you a certificate with which you could actually find a job. And it exploded. I mean, it expanded so much because of this, with these women now clamoring to get in, that they actually used 2 and then 3 floors of the Barbizon as the dormitory for Katie Gibbs in New York. So you really had this, and a lot of models as well started to come in the 1930s as well, because it was as the Great Depression, was sort of dragging out, the idea that women were taking men's jobs, of course, became very resonant to the public. And so women sort of had to try to take jobs that men couldn't have, right? So by then, secretarial work was seen as women's work, so that was okay. And also modeling started to enter the picture. And of course, women models, right? A job that women could do. So you see this sort of flurry of models and Katie Gibbs secretarial students with their white gloves and their hats they were not allowed to remove, not even in the subway. They had to have a certain image. So, of course, this also built up the image of the Barbizon.
Without question. And the no men rule, when they looked back, was that restricting in many ways? Although men try to get in all the time, disguised as doctors and whatever.
Exactly, as gynecologists, exactly, on call. I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
No, did they think the men only rule was a plus or a negative in those years?
Of course. Well, that's the thing. Depends which year, right? So it was definitely, at the beginning, up until the early 1960s, it was an absolute plus, because that restrictive rule meant freedom for women, because it meant respectability. The hotel was seen as respectable because men were not allowed in beyond the lobby. And with respectability, women got freedom. And it's exactly the thinking that Betsy Talbot had in terms of bringing the Mademoiselle interns into the Barbizon, was because it was seen as respectable and therefore would give them the freedom to come to New York. So, but that link between restriction, sort of a nunnery, right? Restriction and freedom started to melt away, of course, in the 1960s. Women had more options. Women were not so keen on being somewhere where they could invite men up to their room. And at the same time, certainly by the 1970s, the hotel, just like New York, is starting to show real wear and tear. Meg Wolitzer, the writer, she was in the last group in 1979 for Mademoiselle magazine, and she wrote a wonderful thing about that summer, and she said New York was looking like an episode of Kojak. So, it's a wonderful line. So actually by 1981, because women were not as keen to stay there anymore and the occupancy rates were so low, they had to bring men in. And there was a lot of kickback, but it was the only option. And they did this sort of very public raffle where the first man and the first couple, it was on Valentine's Day, and they had balloons and music and cake, and then they gave the key to the first man and the key to the first couple, and they ran into the hotel and up beyond the lobby, right? So it's this big thing. But after that, actually, soon after that, the hotel closed down for multiple renovations, sort of turning itself into a regular hotel. And each time it didn't quite work. And eventually the hotel in the early 2000s, of course, at that point now we went from sort of Kojak, New York, to increasingly expensive, much sought after New York. And so a lot of the hotel owners were turning their hotels into luxury condo buildings. And that's exactly what happened to the Barbizon. But what is fascinating is that as the renovations began in the 1980s and dragged on for about 2 decades before the building was turned into a condo building, during this whole time, you still had these women, right, who had contracts, who were living at the Barbizon. And when these renovations started to happen, they hired a good tenant lawyer who discovered that their rooms are considered by New York law rent control rooms. So they couldn't move. They couldn't be moved, or rather, they couldn't be moved out. And so it's fascinating, as the hotel was being renovated in these multiple versions of the 80s and the 90s, when on most floors, if you went to the end of the hallway, opened the door, behind it was the old Barbizon with the old paint and the old women.
Unbelievable.
Incredible. And finally, in the early 2000s, when it was going to be turned into condo and they had to completely gut it, I mean, it's nothing like it used to look. When they had to gut it, they moved the women out to another hotel and then moved them back in. And there are about 4, I believe, left now. And they have their own. I know they have their own floor, beautifully renovated apartments, huge terrace. Yeah, and ultimately, it's funny because they were called, these older women who stayed on and on and on at the hotel were called, from the time that Plath was there, they were called the women, and they were everybody's nightmare because, of course, the Barbizon was supposed to be this launching pad for your ambition. If you were still there, the idea was that you'd failed, right? And so nobody wanted to be like the women. And, of course, the irony is that the women won out because they have their luxury condo apartments exactly in New York today.
Fantastic. And the Barbizon, the hotel that set women free, now in paperback, but there were such good stories in it. I liked when Liza Minnelli lived there, her mother,
Yes.
Judy Garland, took care of that. And then you say the desk went crazy because she called every 3 hours to check on her.
Exactly.
Well,
exactly.
It's a wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
And you're going to find out that, yes, some of the ladies are still alive, living in their multi-million-dollar places now. So, yes, they won in the end. Continued success. Thank you for the book, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sylvie. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Pleasure. Bye-bye. I'm Joan Hamburg, and you're listening to WABC.
Hello, folks. Larry Kudlow here. Pay attention, because China is leading the largest anti-American alliance since World War II, one that's already dumped U.S. bonds, grabbed 43 million acres of our farmland, and is plotting to dethrone the dollar. That's why IRA and 401k savers are protecting their savings with gold. Please go to freegoldguide.com/Kudlow or just call 800-621-3908 for your free gold guide on how to protect your wealth with gold 100% tax-free.